They laughed at her wheelchair. They mocked the way she entered the courtroom, as if her presence was a mistake, an inconvenience. But what no one in that room knew was that the young woman they tried to humiliate carried something no degree or title could teach: courage. And when the judge mocked her in front of everyone, thinking he was putting her in her place, he was actually setting the stage for the most humiliating moment of his own career, because just minutes later, that same judge would be forced to rise to his feet and applaud her. And what this young woman did that day would turn silence into reverence and shame into honor. If this story already moved you in the first few seconds, like this video, comment strength and dignity below, and subscribe to the channel right now. You do not want to miss the ending. Let justice begin. The courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm that morning. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Paperwork shuffled behind reception desks. Lawyers moved like chess pieces, precise, impatient, self-important. Courtroom 4B, however, was especially crowded. A heated discrimination case was about to be heard, and word had gotten out. Inside, people chatted in low murmurs. An older woman whispered something to her teenage granddaughter. Two young lawyers smirked at something on a phone screen. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the air already felt heavy with anticipation. Then came the sound, subtle but clear, rubber wheels gliding across polished tile. No one looked at first. It was almost background noise. But the moment the door opened fully, silence rippled down the front rows. She entered slowly, with quiet certainty. A young woman, no older than 25, guiding her wheelchair like a chariot. She wore a navy blue blouse, simple slacks, no flashy jewelry, no designer shoes. There was no pretense to her, but there was presence, and it filled the room more than any uniform or badge could. Her name was Isadora Campos. She paused just past the door, scanned the room calmly, and rolled toward the front, toward the defense table, alone, without legal counsel. Without hesitation, the clerk at the front desk looked up and blinked in confusion. Can I help you, ma'am?" "Yes," she replied. "I'm here for the Campos versus Lindale case. I'm representing myself." Murmurs rose immediately. Someone let out a soft chuckle. A woman whispered, "She's joking, right?" But Isadora wasn't joking. Across the room, Judge Anthony Matthews entered through his private door, adjusting his robe as he stepped up to the bench. He sat, shuffled some papers, then looked up at her. "Miss Campos, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "You're representing yourself?" "I am." He squinted, skeptical. "I hope you're aware that this isn't a college debate club. This is a court of law." Laughter again. Just a ripple, but deliberate. Isadora didn't respond. She waited. Let it pass. The judge leaned forward, scanning her wheelchair like it was a punchline. "Well," he said, "as long as your vehicle doesn't knock anything over, I suppose we can proceed." The laughter grew louder. But Isadora didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't shake. She simply looked up, met the judge's eyes, and replied, "I've knocked down bigger things than a desk, Your Honor, but I came to build something today." And the room froze. Phones lowered, brows furrowed. Even the judge recoiled slightly, caught off guard by the sharpness behind her calm voice. In the back row, a tall man in a grey suit, who'd been sipping coffee quietly, set down his cup, folded his arms. He didn't smile. He didn't speak, but he watched her, like he'd been waiting to see someone like her walk into that room, because Isadora wasn't just another self-represented plaintiff. She was a woman who had already faced what most people in that room never would, and she didn't come to be pitied. She came to win. Judge Matthews adjusted his posture as if preparing to establish control over the room, though it was clear he felt slightly rattled by Isadora's confidence. He tapped the edge of his bench with his pen, scanning the file in front of him. "Miss Campos," he said, almost sighing, "I must remind you that emotional speeches do not hold weight here. This is a courtroom, not a TED Talk." A few in the gallery laughed. A polite, restrained laugh, but no less condescending. Isadora's expression didn't change. She turned her chair a few degrees toward the center of the courtroom and placed a thick, organized folder on her lap. Her movements were calm, rehearsed, not out of arrogance, but because this wasn't her first time being underestimated. "I understand, Your Honor," she said, clearly and slowly, "which is why I didn't bring emotion. I brought evidence." That quieted the room a little. She opened the folder and began distributing documents to the bailiff, who handed copies to the judge and the court clerk. "These are internal company emails between upper management discussing the optics of having visibly disabled employees in client-facing roles. These are time-stamped messages between HR and my former supervisor, suggesting my termination be disguised as performance issues following my accident. And this," she lifted a final stack of papers, "is a list of 3 other employees, all women who were let go under nearly identical circumstances after developing physical conditions." A shift rippled through the courtroom. What had started as curiosity was turning into interest, real interest. Judge Matthews flipped through a few pages, then looked back at her. "And your claim is that these terminations, yours included, were based solely on your disability? Not just mine, Your Honor. Ours, a pattern, a policy, whether written or not. And if the court permits, I'll demonstrate it with precedent, labor code violations, and recorded testimonies from 2 of the other former employees." The gallery was completely still now. No one checked their phones. No one whispered. Even the smirking attorneys in the back leaned forward, now paying attention. "That's quite a bold claim for someone without legal training," Judge Matthews muttered, trying to reclaim the narrative. Isadora looked him directly in the eyes. Sometimes it takes someone without training to notice what trained eyes refuse to see. The clerk raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed. The judge didn't respond. He looked down, tapped his pen again, but this time without rhythm. In the back of the room, the man in the grey suit stood. No one stopped him. He walked to the far left side of the courtroom and took a seat just 3 rows from the front, then crossed his arms again. Another man stood a moment later on the opposite side, also silent. Also watching. It wasn't coincidence. These weren't random spectators. They were watching Isadora the way people watch history happen. And somewhere deep in his chest, Judge Matthews felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not intimidation, not anger, respect. But it was too late to admit it, because the girl in the wheelchair wasn't here to be respected. She was here to change the rules. Judge Matthews adjusted his glasses, visibly unsettled. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this, not by someone who, according to every unwritten rule in his mind, should have been intimidated into silence. Isadora, on the other hand, wasn't just unfazed, she was locked in. "Your Honor," she said, flipping another page from her folder, "you mentioned earlier that this is a court of law, not a stage for emotion. I agree. So let me stick to facts." Her voice didn't waver. It didn't rise or fall for drama. It was precise, like someone building a house brick by brick. "On March 4th, I filed an internal complaint after being told by my supervisor that my wheelchair made clients uncomfortable." She lifted a printed email. "This is his written response. Notice the wording. We must prioritize image and fluid mobility during pitches." She emphasized the phrase with her finger. "That same week, I was removed from a major project I had led for 5 months. Someone in the courtroom whispered, 'Wow,' under their breath. The judge tried to maintain his detachment, but he was beginning to realize this wasn't a girl fumbling through a defense. This was a full-on prosecution, and he was just a stop on her way to justice. "Miss Campos," he said carefully, "do you have witnesses to corroborate these events?" Isadora nodded once. "2, Your Honor. One of them is my former co-worker who resigned in protest after my termination. The other is a senior HR manager who, under oath, stated in a separate case that the company followed an unofficial policy of visually screening candidates and employees for physical limitations. Murmurs spread again, but they weren't mocking this time. They were stunned. Isadora reached down, pulled out a flash drive, and handed it to the bailiff. "On this drive," she said, "is a screen recording of the virtual exit interview I had with HR. I recorded it legally in accordance with state law. In that video, I'm told, quote, 'This has nothing to do with performance. You just don't project the image we're aiming for.'" Gasps now, audible, sharp. Judge Matthews took the flash drive, looking at it like it was glowing. He didn't speak. Behind Isadora, the man in the grey suit remained standing, his arms still crossed, his gaze unshaken. He knew what this was. He'd seen a version of it in different uniforms, in different wars, people underestimating the quiet ones, right up until the moment they made the ground move beneath them. And then another stood, not a man in a suit, not a soldier, a woman, mid-40s, professional clothes, sharp posture. She stood from the gallery, walked forward silently, and sat 2 rows behind Isadora. Then another, and another, 3, then 5. Then 7 people stood and moved toward her. Quietly, respectfully, as if drawn by gravity. They weren't part of her case. They didn't know her story, but now they did. And without a single request, without a single word from Isadora, she had witnesses. The judge blinked. He looked around at the shifting room, and for the first time since taking the bench that day, he felt small. Judge Matthews cleared his throat, but it didn't help. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke again. "We'll, take a short recess before reviewing the video submission." He reached for his gavel, tapping it once, lightly, as if afraid even the sound might betray his slipping authority. The bailiff announced the recess, and people began standing. But no one rushed for the door. No chatter, no usual shuffle of papers, just a slow, stunned murmur spreading across the room. Isadora remained still. She didn't turn, didn't rise. She simply reached down, pulled the photo from her lap, folded in half, creased at the corners. It showed her before the accident, standing beside her mother outside her college building. Same eyes, same posture, a different world. She stared at it for a long moment. Behind her, the courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like something heavier, like a place that had just witnessed its own hypocrisy in the mirror and wasn't sure how to look away. She could feel their eyes on her, but they weren't eyes of pity anymore. They were searching for understanding, for explanation, for permission to feel uncomfortable about what they had just heard. And that's when the woman who had stood behind her, a stranger just 30 minutes ago, stepped forward. She didn't speak to Isadora. She faced the courtroom. "I don't know this young woman," she said, her voice clear, "but I've sat in this same courtroom and felt invisible." All eyes turned to her. 3 years ago, I filed a discrimination complaint with this court. It was dismissed in 20 minutes. I was told I didn't have enough concrete proof. Today I realized I didn't lack proof. I lacked presence. I lacked what she just showed us all. The judge didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Another man spoke from the side row. "She's doing what we were all too scared to do." More nods. Quiet murmurs of agreement. Isadora slowly turned her chair to face them, just slightly. Enough to acknowledge the momentum that was rising around her, but not enough to bask in it. That was never her goal. She wasn't here to inspire. She was here to be heard. And now, the room that once mocked her was holding its breath. A law student in the back pulled out his phone, not to record, but to take notes. The 2 young lawyers who had smirked earlier. One was crying. The clerk stood. Judge Matthews watched this silent revolution build in real time, a courtroom that had obeyed him for decades. Now orbiting around a girl who had no law degree, no firm, no senior partner, just a chair. And the truth. His gavel still rested. Near his right hand, he didn't reach for it, because deep down even he knew. The balance of power had shifted, and when the court resumed, it wouldn't just be to review evidence, it would be to confront the very thing this system was built to deny, that sometimes the people we ignore the most come back with the loudest echoes. The courtroom reconvened 15 minutes later, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't awkward or dismissive. It was attentive, heavy, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to hear what came next. Isadora was already in position, calm, centered, focused. Judge Matthews returned to the bench slowly. He looked older somehow, as if the weight of the last hour had aged him. His robe felt heavier on his shoulders. His usual posture, proud, chin high, had softened into something closer to caution. The clerk reinserted the flash drive. The monitor flickered to life. "Play it," the judge said, voice low. The courtroom screen lit up with a grainy video. Isadora sat in a video call window, her expression polite but visibly tense. On the other side, a well-dressed HR executive stared coldly into the camera. There was no warmth, no empathy. "We appreciate your work with us, Isadora," the HR rep said, "but unfortunately your role has been phased out due to structural changes." "Can you define structural changes?" Isadora asked. There was a pause. The rep glanced down at his notes. "We're re-evaluating front-facing positions and prioritizing a more dynamic, mobile presentation. It's about optics." There it was. The courtroom gasped audibly. The judge blinked. The clerk pressed. Pause. Silence. Isadora didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. She had lived that moment. Replaying it again wasn't for her. It was for them. "Resume," she said softly. The tape continued. "So," Isadora said in the recording, "I'm being let go because I use a wheelchair." The HR rep shifted. Uncomfortable. Defensive. "We're not framing it like that. But that's what it is. This decision is final." Click. The video ended. The light seemed brighter now. Harsher. There was no laugh in the room this time. No whisper, no mutter, only stillness. Judge Matthews sat with his hands folded in front of his mouth. He didn't speak right away. Finally, "Miss Campos, is that your full statement?" Isadora nodded. "No's, for now." The judge turned to the opposing counsel, a well-paid attorney who hadn't said a word since the recess. He looked at his notes, looked at the judge, then looked at Isadora. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "we'd like to request an adjournment. My client needs time to reassess their position." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Adjournment granted. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks." The bailiff called it out. People rose, but it wasn't the usual chaotic departure. Many stayed seated. Many turned toward Isadora. One woman clapped. Just. Once, then another followed, then a third, and suddenly the courtroom wasn't just a legal chamber. It was a standing ovation. Not loud, not theatrical, but deliberate, emotional. People stood and clapped for a girl in a wheelchair who walked no steps that day, but moved everyone. Even the judge stood. He didn't want to, but something in him rose anyway, like his body knew what. His pride still resisted, and when his eyes met Isadora's again, she nodded, not with anger, not with smugness, just truth, because sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that never raised its tone. The next morning, Isadora woke up before sunrise, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she didn't want to. The light. Outside was soft, barely blue, and her apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. She sat at her kitchen table, tea steeping in front of her, hands resting on the folder she had brought to court, the same one that had trembled slightly in her lap just before her opening statement. But it didn't tremble now. Her phone buzzed. Quietly. She glanced at the screen. 198 unread messages, emails, DMs, mentions, some from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Others from total strangers, law students, journalists, young women with disabilities. Some just said thank you. Others said, I didn't know I was allowed to stand up like that. She didn't know how to answer them all. She didn't know if she had to, because the courtroom was never about going viral. It was never about exposure. It was about her mother and the promise she made on the first night after the accident. Lying in a hospital bed with a fractured spine and a mind full of rage. Back then she had begged the nurse to close the curtain. She didn't want to be seen. Today, everything had changed. She rolled to her window, looking out at the early light. Down below, a reporter waited near the building entrance. Not pushing, not crowding, just waiting. She'd seen the story everyone had now. Young woman in wheelchair silences courtroom. And judge. Some headlines were worse, some more poetic than she deserved. But the one that stuck with her came from a disability rights forum. She didn't break the system. She made it admit it was broken. By noon, her voicemail was full. A law firm in Atlanta had left a message. So had a producer from a documentary studio in Chicago and a woman named Ruth, who worked for the Justice Department. But none of that compared to the email that made her. Eyes blur. Isadora, I was in the back row. I didn't stand. I wanted to, but I froze. You reminded me of my sister, the one we lost to a system that never listened. Thank you for making them here. Carla, 48. Brooklyn. Isadora set her phone down. She didn't cry, she didn't cheer. She just closed her eyes and breathed in silence that didn't hurt anymore. That night, back at the courthouse, a janitor moved through Courtroom 4B, sweeping up programs, collecting coffee cups left behind. When he reached the defense table, he paused. On the floor, almost hidden beneath the bench, was a printed page. He picked it up, a photograph, slightly wrinkled. A young woman standing beside an older one. Same smile. He didn't know her name, but he stared at it for a moment. Then quietly, the janitor tucked it inside his pocket and kept sweeping. Because some stories don't end with a verdict. Some stories walk out of the courtroom and start walking through the world. 1 week later, Isadora returned to Courtroom 4B, but not for herself. She wasn't dressed for battle this time. No folder, no exhibits, no opening statement rehearsed in the mirror. She wore a soft grey sweater, a loose braid down her back, and a look of quiet clarity. She was here. For someone else, the hallway outside the courtroom felt familiar, but not intimidating anymore, like a place she had conquered, not just entered. She moved easily past the security check, offering a small nod to the officer at the scanner, who gave her a half-smile in return. When she entered, the room was half empty, just a clerk. A bailiff, one nervous-looking man seated at the defendant's table, mid-40s, trembling fingers, eyes darting, and beside him, a young woman, early 20s, brown skin, 2 thin arms, legal pad shaking in her lap. Isadora rolled up beside her and gently tapped the armrest of her chair. The woman jumped slightly, then recognized her. Her eyes widened. Are you her?" she whispered. Isadora nodded once. "You're representing yourself today." The girl nodded, her throat visibly tight. "They cut off my benefits. Said I missed a deadline. I didn't. I have it all here, but—" She trailed off. "I'm not sure I can do this." Isadora reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a small, yellow post-it note. On it, only 7 words, handwritten in black ink. "Don't try to sound smart. Try to sound certain." She handed it over. The girl read it. Tears welled up, but didn't fall. "You've already done the hard part," Isadora said. "You showed up." Before she could say more, the judge entered, not Matthews this time. A younger woman, sharp eyes, brisk tone. The court called the case. The girl rose, still shaking slightly, and Isadora rolled back into the gallery. She watched, not with judgment, not with critique, with solidarity, because once, not long ago, she had been that voice in the storm. Now she was the quiet anchor in the back of the room, proof that it could be done. As the young woman began to speak, her voice wavered, but steadied. She referenced forms, dates, miscommunications. She explained how her housing was impacted by the cutoff, how she had filed an appeal on time, only for it to be ignored. Her hands stopped shaking halfway through. By the end, she looked at the judge directly. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm asking for what I earned." And there it was, a sentence that echoed like thunder to Isadora's ears. She smiled, because the trial had never been the destination. It had been the door, and now others were stepping through it. Not because she opened it for them, but because she proved it wasn't locked. Months passed, the courtroom faded, the headlines disappeared, but the echo of what happened that day didn't. Isadora wasn't trying to become a symbol. She never wanted to be anyone's hero. She just didn't want to disappear. And because of that choice, because she refused to fold quietly, something changed. In cities she'd never visited, legal clinics began referencing her case as part of their training. Professors cited her testimony in lectures on systemic bias. Her video, still being shared, not for the drama, but for the delivery, not for how loud she spoke, but for how clear she was. She'd receive letters from girls still in wheelchairs, boys in speech therapy, men who left jobs because they couldn't take the silence anymore. They didn't write to her like she was a lawyer. They wrote like she was family, like she had done something sacred, not won a case, but made them visible. One evening she was invited to speak at a university, not as a guest lecturer, not as a motivational speaker, as the keynote, the opening voice. She almost didn't go, not because she was nervous, but because she didn't feel like she had anything new to say. But when she wheeled herself onto that stage, across polished wood and under glowing lights, she looked out at a packed auditorium of students, professors, and community leaders. And she realized something. The courtroom hadn't been the climax of her story. It was just the moment the world finally looked up. She spoke slowly, honestly, with the same quiet steel that once stopped a judge mid-sentence. "You don't have to be loud to be right," she said. "You don't have to be perfect to be powerful. You don't have to walk to move the world." The room went still, not a phone in sight, because they weren't hearing inspiration, they were hearing truth. That night, she left without fanfare. No after-party, no photo ops, just a ride home, with a friend and a warm meal waiting on the stove. As she rolled into her living room, past a shelf stacked with books and a framed photo of her mother, she paused at the window. Outside, the streetlight flickered. Somewhere down the block, two kids were arguing about something trivial, loud voices, laughter, life moving forward, and she smiled, not because she had won, but because she had endured, because sometimes that's the whole point, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself you were right to stand, even while sitting down,